Okay, so to pick up where we left off in class the other day, we'll finish up talking about visual attention. And the first thing I want to talk about under this topic is what is called feature integration theory. And this was first proposed by Ian Treisman back in the late 60s, in which feature integration theory tries to explain how we find things in our visual environment, how we pay attention to them, and how we allocate our attention towards specific objects in our environment. So basically a visual search of our environment. So this refers to scanning the environment for particular features. Performance on these kinds of tasks will depend on what we're looking for, what we call the target, and its background. So this is related to the Ulrich-Neisser demonstration we did previously under pattern recognition. It's a similar kind of task where you're scanning the environment trying to find something. In these cases, oftentimes it's what we call a pop-out phenomenon, where you're looking for, in this case it would be the blue R, in this case it would be the red G. They stick out because they're basically the only one that's like that. That's opposed to something like this, where the task would be to find the orange Q. It takes a little bit more time to try to locate that particular stimulus because you have to try to bind a couple of features together. And that's what this whole theory is about, is what we call integrating those features or feature binding. So there are a couple of different ways that this shows up. One is what we call a feature search, and this occurs when we only need a single feature to detect some sort of target. So we often call these a pop-out phenomenon because the feature that we're looking for will pop right out at us. This is what people often do when you see them at the airport and they've tied something brightly colored around their luggage, or they're the only ones with yellow luggage. They're making it much easier for them to find something in that sea of black and navy suitcases. That makes it much easier for them to find. The rest of us who are stuck with our black or navy luggage, who haven't thought to do so, have to engage in what we call a conjunction search. And this is required when two features must be used in conjunction to detect the target, or two or more features, I should say. So for example, in this case, we're looking for an orange G, in which case you have to find the right color and the right set of features that makes it a G versus a Q. So we're past pattern recognition and into directing our attention towards some specific thing in the environment. So what feature integration theory explains is the ease of feature searches compared to conjunction searches. So it's pretty easy for us to find something in our environment when it pops right out at us. It's much harder when we have to combine visual elements in order to recognize something or to identify it and locate it. So here's the basic idea. Each individual feature, so redness or roundness or G's or Q's, whatever it is we might be looking for, is associated with a mental map across our visual field. So for every stimulus, the features are represented immediately, simultaneously, and what we call pre-attentively. So before we've done any attentional processing, the entire visual scene is in front of us, but it's represented, each feature has its own visual map. So if we're looking for blue things, that's one map. If we're looking for O's or P's or Q's, that's a second map. Then if we're looking for something else, maybe it's supposed to be upside down, who knows. Whatever feature it is we're looking for, those things have to be, each one of them has their own mental map. So during a feature search, we just monitor the relevant map for the presence of the feature. So that's why we can find it so quickly, because we can scan the entire visual scene all at once. And so this can be done in parallel. So we just look for the entire visual scene for that one feature we're looking for and find it instantly. So feature searches are independent of the size of the display. That is, we can find things just as fast if it's within 5 things as it is 10 things, 20 things, or 30 things. This is very different from conjunction searches. So in a conjunction search, for each object, the features have to be bound together. And as we talked previously, attentional resources are limited, and they take a little bit of time, they take a little bit of effort. And so in a conjunction search, for each object, the features have to be bound together. So for example, if we're looking for an orange G amongst orange Q's and red G's. We can't just find the orange thing. We have to look at each orange thing and then decide if it's a key Q or a G. And so we do that by feature binding. So conjunction searches are therefore carried out sequentially, one object at a time. We do this all the time without ever even thinking about it. Every time you go to the store and you're trying to find your favorite brand of something, whenever you're on the road with your friends trying to find Starbucks, looking for that classic green mermaid logo, basically we do this all the time. We do that when we're looking for our friends. What's the easiest way to find your friends? Knowing what they wear. So when you're out somewhere together, paying attention to what they wear is one of the easiest ways in which we can actually think about trying to find them. So that's feature integration theory. Again, things like trying to find our luggage at the airport. If we have some way to find it quickly using a feature search, it will happen much more quickly. Whereas if we have to combine visual elements, it's going to take much more time. So as you start thinking about things like developing logos, developing product placement, all of those things we try to come up with ways for them to stand out so they can be found easily. Because you want to be able to search the visual scene and find what you're looking for very quickly. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the intersection between attention and visual perception, and we just started getting at this with this idea of attentional binding. There are some other things we have to keep in mind when it comes to how attention and perception interact. And the first of these has to do with inattentional blindness. We've already seen this when we watch the video of people passing the ball back and forth and the girl with the umbrella walks through. And what happens in inattentional blindness is we pay attention to one aspect of a visual scene, and that then can make us blind to the other aspects of the scene because we're inhibiting those other aspects of the scene and only focusing on one, whatever it is we're focused on. So when we're driving a car, we can end up with inattentional blindness. Walking, all sorts of things can happen throughout the day. One of the things that this can result in is what we call change blindness. And to demonstrate change blindness, the easiest thing to do is to see it in action. So we have this gentleman asking for directions. Other guys giving some directions. Go down here, turn there. And then, oh. You can see he hasn't even noticed the fact that the person in front of him has changed. Now, in his defense, they don't look very different, and I'm not sure I'd notice the difference. But we watch this one. Again, we're asking for directions. Now this guy's in a completely different colored shirt. She still hasn't noticed, which is really pretty remarkable. So there's all sorts of these kind of videos you can watch online. There's games you can play that have to do with what we call change blindness, whether or not you notice the difference in some visual scene. All of this relates to these inhibitory accounts of visual attention that we talked about. What we've discovered over the years is that attention is directed to objects, locations, or different aspects of a stimulus, and whatever it is that we're ignoring are actively inhibited. So if we're inhibiting a location, a specific object, or an aspect of an object, immediately following that, we'll have a harder time recognizing or identifying those things we've been ignoring, or finding things that are in those locations. So if we've been ignoring a location, it takes longer to identify something in that location because it's been actively inhibited. If we're actively inhibiting some object, and then we ask somebody to identify that object, it'll take them longer to identify. That's what we call negative priming. We talked previously about facilitated priming, where reaction times are improved by the repeated presence of a stimulus or repeated processing of a stimulus. That we say, put up a word, we put up the word again, and people are faster at identifying that. That's priming. In a negative priming experiment, usually they have two overlapping things, like drawings in Steve Tipper's classic experiment, and they pay attention to one and ignore the other. And usually it was basic line drawings of like musical instruments. And what they found is that participants were much slower at identifying whatever had been ignored immediately following. And that's what they called negative priming. We talked already a little bit about spatial orienting, where locations are ignored, and then of course we have the Stroop effect, where it's harder to ignore one aspect of a stimulus over another. So that's all of looking at visual attention. We're going to tie this all together next time when we talk about neuroscience of attention. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about divided attention and a little bit of these sort of misnomers about divided attention. We can do more than one thing at a time, so long as they aren't competing with one another, and so long as they don't take up more processing resources than are available. So the basic idea here is to explain how we can perform more than one task at a time, what we call dual task performance. And in general, what we've discovered is we have a limited pool of resources, and the amount of cognitive resources required by a task depends on how complex the task is, what we call task complexity. So the more complex something is, the more resources it's going to take up. And we've talked a little bit about this, like when you're driving and all of a sudden you're lost, or traffic gets harder, things get tense. We want to limit what's happening in our environment. So we'll turn down the radio, tell somebody please be quiet for a minute. Usually people in a car will notice that, suddenly they're going to need to focus, so I'll be quiet. But anything that requires a great deal of task complexity requires all of our attention. And you've probably noticed there are some topics that you can study for with TV on and some that you can't. And that's perfectly normal, because sometimes we need to focus all of our resources on one thing. You've also probably noticed that sometimes when you're doing something really complex and difficult, you have no idea what's going on around you because you're so absorbed in that complex task. It's because all of your attentional resources are caught up in that task. So one of the things that we have to think about is the allocation of these limited resources. When our pool of resources is insufficient, we have to allocate resources, and as a result, some tasks may suffer if we've used up those resources. And so when we start talking about when tasks start to compete with one another, we've used up our resources, and now we're no longer dividing attention, we're actually task switching. And so this happens pretty quickly. Something like driving a car really takes all of our cognitive resources, and there isn't much left over for doing other things. So what we often talk about are what we call allocation policies. And this is a pretty important basic idea of how we allocate our attention. And one of these has to do with what we call enduring dispositions. These are built-in stimuli that will automatically capture our attention and will always capture our attention. These tend to be sort of primal instinct kinds of built-in stimuli. Fast-moving objects, loud noises, crashing sounds, screams, gunfire, which would, I guess, go under loud noises, babies crying, and our name, which is probably the one that isn't necessarily related to survival, but might be. These are things that will always capture our attention, no matter what. Our other rest of the time, we deal with what are called momentary intentions. And these are situational dispositions to allocate resources depending on the situation. So again, when you're driving your car, you're allocating your attentional resources across a variety of complex tasks. If you're in traffic, you're monitoring traffic in front of you, and if you're smart, in front of the people who are in front of you and up a couple cars to try to see, are people braking? Is there something going on I need to know about? Do I need to change lanes? So that's going on, plus you're steering and applying the brake and the gas, and then you might be turning the radio up or down or trying to find something to listen to or something different to listen to, or if you're like me, it's NPR and you're trying to listen to what's happening, and so all of that's taking up a lot of resources. So, but if something suddenly important happens, you hear a crash, you hear squealing tires, that's going to automatically capture your attention. And so you'll go away from those momentary intentions to those enduring dispositions. So, some predictions about divided attention. We can attend to more than one thing so long as our resources are not exceeded. Performance on one task will decline if the resource pool is exceeded. The system is flexible. but we don't have a ton of resources, and as a result, this idea of multitasking really is limited to very basic tasks. Anything that's more complicated, you can't do more than one at a time, and you'll always suffer, or the performance on one task will always suffer. One of the keys to this is automaticity. Well-practiced tasks that we have become very good at, that we become expert at, that become automatic, require fewer resources. So it requires almost no resources for you to reach over and hit the turn signal. But that's one part of a whole complex series of things that you're automatically trying to do at the same time. As a result, one area of attention research that has received a great deal of attention is distracted driving. So keep in mind that attention, like all cognitive processes, has its limits. Any additional tasks that we add to that take away resources from other tasks. So obviously the biggest thing is often cell phones and driving. It helps in terms of just the mechanics of driving to have hands-free kits, but hands-free kits, Bluetooth oftentimes provides us with a perceived safety net that perhaps really isn't there, because we're still having to concentrate on other aspects of driving the car. My particular vehicle has sort of some built-in features, so it will read text messages out loud to me if I decide to do that. I can dial the phone from the touchscreen in the car, which makes it easier because it's bigger. One of the things we haven't talked about is what's called Fitts Law, and Fitts Law has to do with how long it takes us to move from one location to the other. So when we're moving our hand, trying to punch a button, for example, it's easier to do so if it's a larger target, so it requires fewer attentional resources if you're trying to find a bigger button. And so those in-car safety features do help, but they don't take away, they just reduce the cognitive load. So keep that in mind. It's easier usually to hit some well-rehearsed buttons on the dashboard that require 2 buttons to dial the phone rather than trying to dial somebody through your phone. There are some clear data on how cell phone use and driving interact. These are cell phone conversations, which take up fewer attentional resources than texting and driving, so anything that's not a conversation is actually going to be worse than this. So here we have single task performance. They're just on the cell phone. They don't miss much. If they're on the cell phone and driving, they miss quite a bit. Sorry, this is just driving and cell phone, driving and controlling the radio. The radio is something, again, part of this has to do with what's called Fitts Law. And reaction times increase dramatically if you're on the cell phone while driving versus playing with the radio and driving. So just driving versus driving and on the cell phone, you're more likely to miss something and you're much slower. This is about a 60-70 millisecond difference, which is an eternity when you're traveling at 80 miles an hour. And the takeaway message here is try not to be on your cell phone when you're driving. It's the act of having that conversation that oftentimes will disrupt that processing. Some other things to think about. As I mentioned in class the other day, heads-up displays like this are starting to become more common. One of the biggest problems with that is if we stay focused in this area, people tend to think they can actually see the rest because they're looking up. There's a great deal of research with heads-up displays in airplanes that show that pilots in particular, tend to think they can see what's in front of them. But remember, this is that inattentional blindness. Because your attention is focused here, you may not see this motorcycle here, or you may not see somebody running across the street in front of you, because your attention's focused here, but you won't be aware of the fact that you're not looking at the road because you think you're looking at the road. Whereas if you're looking down here at the speedometer, you know you're not looking at the road, so you glance down and glance back up. So these are probably an inherently bad idea. Okay. So that's our basic introduction to attention. So take a look at these review questions and summary questions that I nabbed out of somebody else's textbook. These are different from the ones in your own textbook, so again, I try to provide as many different kinds of reviews as you can. Our next topic is going to be on neuroscience of perception and attention, and so hopefully that'll be very interesting, and we'll cover that on class on Tuesday. Everyone have a safe and great weekend.